The snow was already falling when Clara Whitfield realized the man she was meant to marry was never coming. She stood outside the small stone chapel on the edge of Ashcombe village, her white gloves clutched so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale beneath them. The guests behind her had stopped whispering an hour ago. Now they simply stared, some with pity, some with something closer to hunger, the way people look when they know they are about to witness a story they will repeat for years. Edmund Caro was not coming. Everyone understood that now, even the vicar, who had closed his prayer book and set it down with the quiet finality of a man closing a coffin lid. Clara did not cry. She had promised herself she would not in front of these people, not in front of the Caro relatives who had traveled 2 days to see their nephew married into a respectable family, not in front of her own aunt, who kept dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as though she were the one who had been abandoned. The snow thickened. It settled on Clara's shoulders, and in the careful curls her maid had spent 2 hours arranging that morning. She did not move to brush it away. She was watching the road, the long empty road that led from the village toward the Caro estate, waiting for a carriage that was never going to appear. A rumor had already begun to travel through the crowd, passed mouth to mouth like a coin nobody wanted to hold. Edmund Caro had left the county entirely. He had taken what remained of his family's money and boarded a ship at the coast before dawn. There was talk of debts, enormous ones, debts to men who did not forgive them easily. There was talk that the wedding itself had only ever been meant to secure Clara's modest inheritance long enough to settle what he owed. Clara heard all of it in fragments, and none of it surprised her as much as it should have. She had known, somewhere beneath the hope she had allowed herself to feel these past months, that something about Edmund's eagerness to marry quickly had never quite made sense. She had simply chosen not to look at it too closely, because looking at it too closely would have meant admitting she was afraid. Now the fear had arrived anyway, dressed as public humiliation, and there was nothing left to do but stand in it. Her aunt finally approached, her face tight with an emotion Clara could not name, somewhere between grief and embarrassment. "We should go inside," her aunt said. "People are staring." "Let them stare," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have done nothing wrong." That is not how the world will see it. Clara knew that too. In a county this small, the story would not be that Edmund Caro was a coward and a thief. The story would be that Clara Whitfield had been left standing at the altar, unwanted, unchosen, discarded like a coat gone out of fashion. It did not matter what was true. It only mattered what people would say over their evening meals for the rest of the winter. She turned to walk toward the carriage that was meant to carry her away as a married woman, and instead would carry her home as nothing at all, when she noticed another carriage stopped further down the road. A dark, finely made carriage, its lacquer catching what little light the gray sky offered. She recognized the crest on its door even from this distance, because everyone in the county recognized it. It belonged to Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Rutherford. He had come, she realized with a sick twist in her stomach, to watch his rival marry. The Duke and Edmund Caro had despised each other for years, for reasons Clara had only ever heard whispered about, something involving old debts and older betrayals between their fathers. She understood now, with painful clarity, that the Duke had likely come today not out of any care for her, but to witness his enemy's triumph and perhaps take some private satisfaction in it. Instead, he had witnessed his enemy's disgrace, and hers alongside it. Clara refused to look toward the carriage. She would not give the Duke of Rutherford the satisfaction of seeing her humiliation up close. She walked past the murmuring guests, past her aunt's outstretched hand, and out onto the road that led away from the chapel, toward nothing in particular, because she needed to move, and she could not bear to stand still a moment longer. The snow was falling harder now. It stung her cheeks and settled into the folds of her wedding dress, a dress that suddenly felt absurd, a costume for a play that had been canceled before the curtain rose. She walked without a clear direction, past the edge of the village, past the last of the cottages, until the road narrowed, and the trees closed in on either side, and the cold began to press through the thin fabric at her wrists. She heard the carriage before she saw it. The steady sound of hooves on packed snow, slower than a gallop, careful, as though whoever drove it did not wish to startle her. She kept walking, refusing to turn, refusing to acknowledge that anyone had followed her at all. The carriage drew alongside her and stopped. A moment later, the door opened, and Adrian Blackwood stepped down onto the road. He was taller than she remembered from the few occasions she had seen him at a distance, at church, at the market fair 2 summers past. His coat was dark and well-made, entirely unsuited to standing in falling snow, and yet he stood in it without any sign of discomfort, watching her with an expression she could not read. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "The temperature is falling quickly, and the light will be gone within the hour." "I am perfectly capable of walking," Clara said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I do not require rescue, Your Grace, least of all from you." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "I am not offering rescue," he said. "I am offering a ride back to shelter, because a woman freezing on an open road serves no one, least of all herself. And why would you care what becomes of me? You came today to see your rival married. I imagine my misfortune has given you exactly the satisfaction you hoped for." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formality. "I came today expecting to feel satisfaction. Yes, I did not feel it. I felt something closer to disgust, watching a man abandon a woman in front of half the county, rather than face what he owed. Whatever quarrel I have with Edmund Caro, it has nothing to do with you, and I have no wish to see you suffer for his cowardice." Clara studied him, searching his face for the mockery she expected to find there, the private amusement of a man enjoying his enemy's downfall from a comfortable distance. She did not find it. What she found instead unsettled her more, because it looked like something close to honesty. "I don't know you," she said finally. "I have no reason to trust that your intentions are as simple as you claim." "You have no reason to trust anything today," he said. "I understand that. But the cold does not care about trust, and neither will the fever you will have by morning if you continue walking in that dress. My estate is less than 20 minutes from here. You may stay one night, recover your strength, and decide your next steps once you are not standing in snow up to your ankles." Clara looked down the road behind her, toward the village she could no longer see clearly through the falling snow, toward the chapel and the guests and her aunt's helpless, embarrassed face. She looked ahead, toward nothing at all. She was cold in a way that had stopped being merely uncomfortable and had become something closer to frightening, a heaviness settling into her hands and feet that she recognized, distantly, as dangerous. Pride told her to refuse. Pride told her to walk on alone rather than accept anything from a man whose only connection to her humiliation was that he had come to watch it happen. But pride, she was beginning to understand, would not keep her warm, and it would not undo what had already happened that day. "One night," she said finally. "And I will leave in the morning, whatever the weather." "One night," the Duke agreed, and something in his voice suggested he did not entirely believe it would be so simple, though he did not say so aloud. He offered his hand to help her into the carriage, and after a long moment, Clara took it. The interior was warm, warmer than she had felt in what seemed like hours, and she sat rigid against the seat, aware of every place the fine fabric of the carriage touched the ruined hem of her wedding dress. Neither of them spoke as the carriage pulled forward, turning away from the village and toward the long private road that led to Rutherford Hall. Clara watched the trees pass in the fading light, snow gathering thick on their branches, and tried not to think about what her life had looked like that morning, before everything in it had come apart in the space of a single unanswered question at the altar. Beside her, the Duke sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the window, his expression unreadable. Clara did not know what to make of him, this man who was supposed to be her fiancé's enemy, and who had instead stopped his carriage on an empty road to keep her from freezing. She did not know what to make of the fact that, for the first time since the chapel doors had failed to bring Edmund Caro through them, she felt something other than humiliation. She felt, cautiously, and against every instinct telling her not to, something close to safe. The carriage rounded a final bend, and the dark shape of Rutherford Hall rose ahead of them through the snow, its windows lit gold against the gray evening. Clara did not know yet what this night would mean, or the nights that would follow it, or how far the consequences of Edmund Caro's cowardice would reach into both their lives. She knew only that the road behind her led back to a life that no longer existed, and the road ahead led somewhere she could not yet see. For now, that would have to be enough. Rutherford Hall was larger than anything Clara had stepped inside before. its entrance hall lit with rows of candles that threw warm light across polished stone floors, and a staircase that curved upward into shadow. A housekeeper appeared almost immediately, a stout woman with sharp eyes named Mrs. Aldridge, who took one look at Clara's condition and began issuing orders before the Duke had even finished removing his gloves. Within the hour, Clara found herself seated by a fire in a small private sitting room, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her ruined wedding dress exchanged for a simple gray gown that belonged, she was told, to the Duke's younger sister. A bowl of hot broth sat untouched in her lap. She stared into the fire instead, watching the flames shift and fold over themselves, and tried to make sense of a day that refused to be made sense of. The Duke did not join her immediately. She was grateful for that. She needed the silence, needed a moment where no one expected her to explain herself or apologize for the inconvenience of her own suffering. When he did appear, nearly an hour later, he knocked softly at the open door rather than entering unannounced, and waited until she looked up before stepping inside. "You have not eaten," he observed, glancing at the broth. "I am not hungry." "You should eat regardless. Grief has a way of making people forget their bodies still require care." He said it plainly, without softness, but there was something in the observation that suggested he understood it from experience, rather than mere politeness. Clara picked up the spoon, more to end the conversation than from any real appetite, but the warmth of the broth was better than she expected, and she found herself finishing more of it than she intended. "I have arranged a room for you," the Duke continued. "My sister Lucy is at present visiting relatives in Bath, so her chamber is empty. You may stay there tonight, and Mrs. Aldridge will see that you have whatever you require. You are very generous to a woman who is, by tomorrow, going to be the subject of every unkind conversation in this county." "I am not generous," he said, with a faint, humorless smile. "I am simply unwilling to let a person freeze on my land because I find the situation inconvenient. If you wish to call that generosity, you may. I would call it the bare minimum decency requires." Clara studied him over the rim of the bowl. He was younger than she had assumed from a distance, perhaps 30, with the kind of composed stillness that came from years of being watched and judged and learning not to let either show on his face. She recognized something of that stillness in herself, though hers had been built in far smaller rooms than his. "Why does everyone speak of you and Edmund Caro as though you were sworn enemies?" she asked, before she could decide whether the question was wise. "I have heard the rumor for years and never understood the truth of it." The Duke's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "That is a longer conversation than tonight allows. You have had enough difficulty for one day without adding my family's history to it." "I think I am owed some explanation," Clara said. "Considering that man's cowardice is the reason I am sitting in your house in your sister's dress. If there is more to his character that I should have known, I would like to hear it, even now." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. "Edmund Caro's father and mine were once close friends, before a business arrangement between them collapsed and took a great deal of my family's fortune with it. There were accusations of dishonesty on both sides, though I have always believed the fault lay more heavily with the Caros. My father never recovered his standing before he died, and Edmund inherited both the debt and, it seems, the willingness to deceive people to escape it. So today was not the first time he has left someone to suffer for his mistakes." "No," the Duke said quietly. "I do not imagine it was." Clara set the bowl aside, her appetite gone again, though not from grief this time. Something colder had settled in its place, a clear-eyed anger at having been so thoroughly deceived, not just by Edmund's absence today, but by every conversation, every promise, every small kindness he had shown her in the months before. All of it now suspect, all of it possibly calculated. "I was a fool," she said quietly. "You were deceived," the Duke corrected. "Those are not the same thing. A fool ignores what is in front of them. You had no way of seeing what he kept hidden. You are very certain of that, for a man who has known me for less than a day." "I am certain of very little," he admitted, "but I have watched enough of my own family's history to recognize the difference between a person who invites their own misfortune and a person who has misfortune placed upon them by someone else's dishonesty. You are plainly the latter." Clara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. and the silence between them settled into something less uncomfortable than it had been before. Outside, the snow continued to fall against the tall windows, and the fire cracked softly in the grate, and for the first time since the chapel doors had failed to open on the man she was meant to marry, Clara felt the tight, panicked knot in her chest loosen, just slightly. She stayed 3 days instead of 1. The first excuse was the weather, which worsened overnight into a storm that made travel of any kind impossible. The second was a mild fever that Mrs. Aldridge insisted required rest before Clara attempted the journey back to her aunt's cottage. The third, Clara did not admit even to herself, though she suspected it had something to do with the strange, unhurried peace of the household, and the way the Duke had begun, almost without either of them noticing, to seek her out in the evenings. They did not speak of Edmund Caro again, not directly. Instead, their conversations wandered into smaller, safer territory. She learned that the Duke read late into the night because sleep did not come easily to him, a habit he attributed, with a dry humor she had not expected from him, to years of managing an estate that seemed determined to produce one crisis after another. He learned that she had grown up the daughter of a country solicitor, that her father had died when she was 15, that she had spent the years since living carefully, modestly, on an inheritance too small to attract genuine suitors, and just large enough to attract men like Edmund Caro, who needed exactly that sum, and no more. "You speak of it so plainly," the Duke said one evening, when she had explained this without any visible self-pity. "Most people would resent being reduced to a sum of money." "I stopped resenting it years ago," Clara said. "Resentment changes nothing. It only makes the waiting harder." "What were you waiting for?" She considered the question longer than she expected to. "I am not entirely certain anymore. I thought I was waiting for a husband, a household of my own, some measure of security. Now I wonder if I was simply waiting for my life to begin, and mistaking any offer of marriage for permission to begin it." The Duke did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "I understand that more than you might expect. A title does not grant permission either. It only grants obligation." On the third evening, as the storm finally began to ease outside, Clara found the Duke in the library, seated near the fire, with a book open on his knee, that he did not appear to be reading. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression, some brief, unguarded flicker before his composure returned, told her that her presence had not been unwelcome. "You are recovered," he observed. "Mrs. Aldridge tells me your fever has broken. I am recovered enough to travel tomorrow, if the roads allow it." Something passed across his face, too quick to name, and he set the book aside. "Your aunt will be relieved to have you home." "My aunt will be relieved that I am no longer her responsibility to explain to the neighbors," Clara said, with more honesty than she intended. "I do not think she is entirely wrong to feel that way. I have brought a great deal of scandal to her door, through no fault of hers." "You brought no scandal to anyone's door," the Duke said, his voice sharper than she expected. "Edmund Caro brought scandal to yours, and to mine, by association, given that half the county now believes I have taken in his abandoned bride." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "The gossip has already reached Rutherford, I imagine. My mother wrote to me this very morning, asking whether the rumors were true." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that a woman was left alone in the cold, through no fault of her own, and that I offered shelter until the storm passed, as any decent person would." "And did she believe the version of events that stops there?" The Duke's expression grew, for a moment, almost rueful. "My mother has never believed the simplest version of anything in her life. But that does not change what actually happened, whatever she chooses to imagine beyond it." Clara moved further into the room, drawn by the fire's warmth and, though she did not wish to admit it, by the quiet steadiness of his presence, so different from the anxious, performing charm Edmund had always shown her. She sat across from him without being invited to, and he did not seem to mind. "I should be grateful to you," she said, "and I am. But I confess, I do not know what to do with gratitude toward a man I still barely understand." "You do not need to understand me," he said. "You need only decide whether you trust that my intentions tonight were honest ones. Understanding can come later, if it comes at all. And if I decide I do trust that, then perhaps," he said carefully, as though testing the weight of each word before he allowed it into the air. We need not rush toward understanding everything else at once. Clara looked at him for a long moment, the fire casting soft, shifting light across his face, and felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon after the humiliation of the chapel steps. Not the giddy, hopeful anticipation she had once mistaken for love with Edmund, but something quieter, steadier, and far more difficult to dismiss. She did not know yet what it meant, or what it would cost either of them once the rest of the county learned the full truth of these 3 days. She knew only that when she left Rutherford Hall the following morning, some part of her would remain behind, waiting, though for what, she could not yet say. Clara did not return to her aunt's cottage the next morning, though she told herself repeatedly that she would. The roads, it turned out, remained treacherous well into the following week, and by the time they cleared enough for safe travel, an invitation had arrived from the Duke's mother, the Dowager Duchess, requesting that Clara remain at Rutherford Hall as her personal guest until the worst of the scandal in the village had settled. Clara suspected, though she never said so aloud, that the invitation had less to do with the roads and more to do with the Duke himself, who had grown quietly insistent that she not return to a village still buzzing with gossip about her abandonment before she had time to recover fully from it. She told herself she accepted the invitation for practical reasons. She did not entirely believe her own explanation, but she accepted it anyway. The Dowager Duchess, when Clara finally met her properly at breakfast 3 days later, was nothing like the imposing figure Clara had braced herself for. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman, with silver hair pinned severely back from her face, and she studied Clara over her teacup with the unhurried thoroughness of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "So," the Duchess said, once the servants had withdrawn, "you are the young woman half the county cannot stop discussing." "I am afraid so, Your Grace," Clara said, keeping her voice even despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "Do not apologize for it. You did nothing to earn the discussion, beyond having the misfortune of trusting a man who did not deserve it." The Duchess set down her cup with a small, decisive click. "I knew his father, you understand. Cunning man, charming in the way that snakes are sometimes charming, right up until they show you their teeth. It does not surprise me in the slightest that the son turned out the same." "You knew the elder Mr. Caro well, then?" Something guarded crossed the Duchess's face, quickly smoothed away. "Well enough to regret it. That is a story for another day, and not entirely mine to tell." She studied Clara a moment longer. "My son tells me you have shown remarkable composure through all of this. I confess I expected to find you a great deal more fragile than you appear. I have had a great deal of practice managing disappointment, Your Grace. It does not make the current situation easier, but it does mean I have some experience surviving it." The Duchess's expression softened, just slightly. "That is a sadder answer than I expected, but an honest one. I appreciate honesty, Miss Whitfield, more than most people in my position have any right to expect from those around them." It was later that same week, in the quiet hours after supper, that Clara finally heard the fuller story of the feud between the Blackwood and Caro families, though it was the Duke himself, not his mother, who finally told it. They had fallen into the habit of walking together in the long gallery after supper, a corridor lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors stretching back generations, their painted eyes following the pair as they walked slowly beneath them. It was during one of these walks, with the house quiet around them and the fire long since banked for the night, that Clara asked again, more directly this time, what had truly happened between his family and Edmund's. The Duke was silent for several paces before he answered. "My father and Edmund's father built a shipping venture together, years before either of us were born. It was profitable, for a time, enough that both families grew comfortable depending on it. Then a series of losses at sea nearly destroyed the venture entirely, and my father discovered, too late, that the elder Caro had been quietly moving funds out of the shared accounts for months before the losses became public. Money that should have covered the debts had simply vanished, leaving my father to absorb the full weight of what remained. Did your father ever prove it? He proved enough to satisfy himself, though never enough to satisfy a court. And by then, the damage to our family's finances and reputation was already done. He spent the rest of his life rebuilding what the venture's collapse had cost us, and I do not believe he ever fully recovered from the betrayal, even after the finances improved. He died believing Edmund's father had stolen not only his money, but his trust in people generally. Clara absorbed this in silence, understanding now the weight behind the wariness she had sensed in the Duke since their first conversation. And you inherited both the estate and the mistrust. I inherited a great deal of caution, yes. Enough that when I learned Edmund intended to marry into a modest but respectable family, I assumed it was simply another version of his father's habits, finding advantage in other people's trust and taking what he needed before anyone noticed the cost. He glanced at her, something apologetic in his expression. I did not consider, until I saw you standing alone on that road, that there might be an actual person suffering the consequences of that habit, rather than simply another abstract debt left unpaid. You make it sound as though you owe me an apology. Perhaps I do, he said quietly. I came to that chapel expecting satisfaction at watching Edmund fail to deliver on something, anything, for once in his life. I did not consider what failure would look like for the person standing at the altar waiting for him. Clara stopped walking, turning to face him fully beneath the painted gaze of some long-dead Blackwood ancestor. You did not cause what happened to me. You do not need to carry guilt for a moment you did not create, only witnessed. Perhaps not, he said. But I find myself unable to regret witnessing it, strange as that may sound, because it means I stopped my carriage that day, instead of continuing past. Something in his voice, low and careful, made Clara's breath catch slightly. She had grown, over these past days, increasingly aware of the careful distance he maintained around her, a distance that felt less like coldness and more like restraint, as though he were deliberately holding something back, rather than lacking it entirely. She wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if that restraint ever slipped. I should tell you something, she said, before she could think better of it. I have begun to feel grateful for what happened, even the humiliation of it, because it led me here, rather than into a marriage that would have ruined me slowly, instead of quickly. That is not a comfortable thing to admit. It is an honest one, the Duke said, and I have come to feel something similarly uncomfortable, if I am equally honest with you. I did not expect, when I stopped that carriage, that the woman inside it would occupy so much of my thinking in the days since. Clara's heart moved unsteadily in her chest. Your Grace. Adrian, he said quietly, if we are being honest with one another, I would prefer you use my name. Adrian, she repeated, testing the shape of it. I do not know what to make of this, of any of it. 3 weeks ago, I was preparing to marry your enemy. I do not know how to make sense of standing here instead, feeling what I am beginning to feel toward you. I do not ask you to make sense of it tonight, he said. I ask only that you allow yourself the possibility that it need not be nonsensical at all. Sometimes, the people who arrive in our lives through the worst circumstances turn out to matter the most, precisely because we were not looking for them. They did not speak of it further that night, both retreating to their respective wings of the house with the careful, unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them, something neither was yet prepared to name aloud. But Clara lay awake long after the candles had been extinguished, turning his words over in her mind, aware of a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire still glowing faintly in her grate. The peace did not last long. 10 days after Clara's arrival at Rutherford Hall, a letter arrived that would end whatever quiet certainty had begun to grow between them, and drag both their names back into the very scandal they had briefly managed to escape. It came from Clara's aunt, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the last of the melting snow, and its contents were brief but devastating. Edmund Caro had not fled the country as everyone believed. He had gone only as far as the coast, waiting for the worst of the immediate scandal to pass. And now, with his creditors temporarily satisfied by funds Clara did not want to imagine the source of, he intended to return to the county within the month. He intended, the letter explained, to insist that the marriage contract between himself and Clara remained legally binding, regardless of the failed ceremony, and that he would pursue whatever means necessary to see it enforced. Clara read the letter twice, in the privacy of her borrowed room, her hands growing colder with each line, before she finally understood the full shape of what was coming. Edmund had not abandoned her out of cowardice alone. He had abandoned her because the timing of the ceremony no longer served his immediate need to escape his creditors. And now, with that immediate danger past, he intended to reclaim what he still believed belonged to him. her modest inheritance, and whatever remained of the arrangement that had briefly promised to save him. She was not merely a woman who had been humiliated and abandoned. She was, in Edmund Caro's eyes, still an asset waiting to be collected. The realization settled over her with a coldness the snow outside had never quite managed to produce. Whatever peace she had found within these walls, whatever fragile, unexpected warmth had begun to grow between herself and the Duke, was about to be tested by a man who had proven, once already, that he valued neither. Clara brought the letter to the Duke that same evening, finding him in his study reviewing accounts by lamplight. He read it twice, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finally set it down, his jaw was tight, in a way she had not seen before. "He means to claim you still belong to him," he said flatly. "Even now, after what he did." "He means to claim my inheritance," Clara corrected. "I am simply the means of collecting it. I do not flatter myself into believing his interest extends any further than that. It does not matter what his true interest is. If he pursues this through legal means, a contracted marriage can be difficult to fully dissolve, particularly if he has funds now to hire solicitors who will argue the ceremony's failure was a mere delay rather than a cancellation." The Duke rubbed a hand across his jaw, something like fury simmering carefully beneath his controlled exterior. "He is counting on you having no resources to fight him, and no family with the standing to protect you from the consequences of refusing. He is likely correct in that assumption." "He is not," the Duke said, his voice suddenly firm. "You are not without resources any longer, Clara. Whatever else remains uncertain between us, I will not allow him to drag you back into a contract built on deception, simply because he believes you have no one to stand against him." Clara felt something tighten in her throat. Gratitude and fear tangled together so closely she could not separate them. "You cannot simply insert yourself into this. Whatever protection you offer will draw your family's name, and mine, into a scandal far larger than anything we have weathered so far. Your mother has already been generous enough in tolerating my presence here. I do not think she will tolerate her son publicly opposing Edmund Caro on my behalf." As if summoned by the mention of her, the Dowager Duchess appeared in the study doorway not an hour later, having heard, through whatever quiet network kept her informed of everything occurring beneath her roof, the substance of the letter. Her expression was grave as she settled into a chair across from them both. "I will not pretend I am pleased by this development," she said without preamble. "I have watched my son grow fond of you these past weeks, Miss Whitfield, and I do not begrudge him that fondness. But I must ask both of you to consider carefully what continuing down this path will cost, particularly if Adrian involves himself publicly in your dispute with Mr. Caro." "What would you have me do instead, Mother?" the Duke asked, an edge entering his voice that Clara had not heard him use with his mother before. "Stand aside and allow him to drag her back into a contract built on lies, simply to preserve our family's comfort? I would have you consider whether this is truly your fight to take on," the Duchess said evenly. "Miss Whitfield has her own family, however modest, who should bear the responsibility of protecting her interests. If you insert yourself too publicly, every rumor already circulating about the two of you will be treated as confirmed fact, and no explanation afterward will undo that impression, whatever the truth actually is." "Your mother is not wrong," Clara said quietly, before the Duke could respond. "I have already brought enough difficulty into this household. I will not be the cause of further damage to your family's standing, not after everything you have already done for me." "And what would you have me do instead?" the Duke asked, turning to her with something almost pleading in his expression, a rare crack in his usual composure. "Watch you return to your aunt's cottage and face him alone, with no protection beyond whatever meager resources a country solicitor's modest inheritance can provide." Clara did not have an answer to that. She looked between the Duke and his mother, feeling the weight of a decision that was not entirely hers to make, settling uncomfortably across her shoulders. That same week, a letter arrived from her aunt as well, its tone entirely different from the anxious sympathy Clara had expected. Her aunt urged her, in careful but unmistakable terms, to consider accepting whatever settlement Edmund Caro proposed, rather than risk a prolonged and public dispute that would only deepen the scandal already attached to their family's name. It would be simpler, the letter suggested, to accept a modest sum in exchange for releasing any further claim to the failed marriage contract. and allow the entire unfortunate episode to fade quietly from memory. Clara read the letter with a growing, uncomfortable clarity. Her aunt was not wrong, that a quiet settlement would end the scandal more quickly than a public dispute. But something in the suggestion struck her as deeply wrong, a quiet echo of the same expectation that had shaped her entire life until now, that she should accept whatever arrangement minimized inconvenience for everyone else, regardless of what it cost her own dignity in the process. She had spent years accepting exactly that kind of arrangement. First, in accepting Edmund's proposal because her aunt believed it the most sensible match available to a woman of her modest means, and now in being asked to quietly accept whatever settlement would make the entire humiliating episode disappear from polite conversation as quickly as possible. She found herself, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, deeply unwilling to accept it. She brought both letters to the Duke the following morning, laying them side by side on his desk. Everyone around me seems to believe the wisest course is for me to disappear quietly from this situation, whether by accepting Edmund's terms or by removing myself from your protection, to spare your family further scandal. I find I am tired of being the quiet, disappearing party in every arrangement made around me. The Duke studied the letters for a long moment before looking up at her. What would you prefer instead? I do not entirely know, Clara admitted. But I know I do not wish to accept a settlement that treats me as though my only value lies in the inheritance attached to my name, and I do not wish to hide, simply because my presence here has become inconvenient for the reputations of people who have shown me more genuine kindness than I have received in years. Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a decision settling into place behind his eyes. Then we will not settle quietly, and we will not hide. If Edmund Caro wishes to pursue this contract, he will have to do so publicly, in full view of a county that already knows precisely the kind of man he is. I would rather face that scandal honestly than watch you accept terms that reduce you to nothing more than an unpaid debt waiting to be collected. Your mother will not approve. My mother, the Duke said, with the faintest trace of a smile, has spent 30 years teaching me that reputation matters, a great deal less than character. However inconvenient that lesson has occasionally proven for her own social standing, I suspect, when it comes to it, she will surprise you. He was right, though it took another difficult conversation before the Dowager Duchess finally relented, her objections softening, not because the risk had lessened, but because she had watched her son's quiet, careful fondness for Clara deepen into something she no longer had the heart to stand against. I will not pretend I am not afraid of what this will cost us, she told them both, but I find I would rather face that cost honestly than watch either of you live with the regret of having done nothing. Word of Edmund Caro's intended return reached the village within days, carried on the same quick currents of gossip that had spread news of Clara's abandonment weeks before. This time, however, the story carried a different shape. It was no longer simply the tale of a jilted bride, but the beginning of something the county had not seen in years, a public confrontation brewing between two of its oldest and most bitter families, with Clara Whitfield standing, unexpectedly, at its very center. Clara felt the weight of every curious glance when she accompanied the Duke into the village that week, felt the whispers trailing behind them like smoke. She did not shrink from it the way she once might have. She had spent enough of her life disappearing quietly to satisfy other people's comfort. Whatever came when Edmund Caro finally returned, she intended to meet it standing exactly where she was, rather than folded quietly out of sight. The Duke walked beside her through the village square, close enough that his presence felt less like protection and more like partnership, and Clara understood, with a clarity that steadied something long unsettled in her chest, that whatever confrontation was coming, she would not face it alone this time. Edmund Caro returned to the county on a bright, cold morning 3 weeks later, and he did not come quietly. He arrived at the village assembly hall on the day of the winter market, when the square was fullest, when the greatest number of eyes could witness whatever he intended to say. Clara understood, the moment she heard the news of his arrival, that he had chosen the moment deliberately, hoping the weight of public attention would pressure her into agreeing to whatever terms he proposed, rather than risk further scandal by refusing him in front of a crowd. She rode into the village that same afternoon, with the Duke beside her, both of them aware of exactly what awaited them, and both of them having agreed, in the quiet hours before, that they would not allow Edmund's choice of setting to work in his favor. The assembly hall was crowded when they arrived, merchants and villagers drawn by both the market and the unmistakable current of anticipation that had been building for days. Edmund stood near the center of the room, dressed finely, his manner carrying the same easy charm Clara remembered from their courtship, though she saw it now for what it truly was, a performance calculated to disarm rather than any genuine warmth. He turned as she entered, and something calculating flickered behind his practiced smile. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, "I am relieved to see you well. I confess I feared the worst, given how abruptly our wedding day concluded." "You fled the county rather than face your creditors," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the crowd's attention pressing in around her. "There is no need to pretend concern for my well-being now, Edmund. We both know precisely why you have returned." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd. Edmund's smile faltered only slightly before he recovered it. "I understand you are angry. I do not blame you for that. But whatever difficulties led to our wedding's unfortunate conclusion, the contract between our families remains legally binding. I have come to discuss how we might honor it, for both our sakes." "For your sake," the Duke said, stepping forward beside Clara, his voice carrying the calm, cutting authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Let us speak plainly, Caro, since you seem reluctant to do so yourself. You fled this county to escape creditors who would have seized whatever remained of your family's holdings had you stayed a day longer. You have returned only now that those debts have been temporarily satisfied, and you require Miss Whitfield's inheritance to satisfy whatever remains." "That is a serious accusation to make in front of witnesses, Your Grace," Edmund said, his composure visibly straining. "I would advise caution before you repeat it. It is not an accusation. It is a fact I am prepared to prove, should you force the matter into a courtroom, rather than settling it honestly here today." The Duke's voice did not rise, but something in its steadiness carried further across the silent hall than shouting could have managed. "I have spent the past 3 weeks gathering exactly the documentation required to demonstrate precisely where your family's remaining funds originated, and precisely how quickly they will vanish again, once your current creditors are satisfied. I would be glad to share that documentation with the entire county, if you insist on pursuing this contract in public." The color drained visibly from Edmund's face. Clara watched the calculation shift behind his eyes, the practiced charm cracking to reveal something far more desperate beneath it. "This is beneath you, Blackwood, dragging old family quarrels into a private matter between myself and my intended." "She is not your intended," Clara said, finding her voice again, steadier now than it had been in weeks. "You made that clear the moment you left me standing in the cold, rather than face the consequences of your own debts. I am not a debt to be collected, once it becomes convenient for you again, Edmund. I am not an asset waiting on your schedule." The crowd had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Clara felt the familiar instinct to shrink from that attention rise in her chest, the same instinct that had kept her quiet and accommodating through years of careful, disappearing choices. She pushed past it deliberately, standing straighter instead. "I refuse the contract," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hall. "Whatever legal claim you believe remains, I refuse it entirely, and I am prepared to contest it through whatever means necessary, with the Duke's support, should you choose to pursue it further. I would rather face every consequence of that refusal than spend another day pretending an obligation exists where only deception ever did." Edmund's expression twisted, the last traces of his charming composure falling away entirely. "You will regret this, both of you. I have connections in this county that neither of you fully appreciate. Your connections," the Duke said evenly, "consist largely of creditors, currently deciding whether to pursue you through the courts themselves. I suspect they will take considerably more interest in your finances than in whatever threats you make here today." He withdrew a folded set of papers from inside his coat, holding them out not to Edmund, but toward the gathered crowd. "For those interested in the truth of Mr. Caro's current circumstances, I have had these documents prepared and available for public review at the county registrar's office, detailing the full extent of his family's outstanding debts and the manner in which they were incurred. I leave it to each of you to decide what weight to give his claims after reviewing them." A ripple of astonishment moved through the assembly hall, whispered conversations breaking out on every side. Edmund looked around at the gathered faces, at the shifting, uncertain expressions of people who had, only moments before, seemed prepared to sympathize with his position, and understood, with visible horror, that whatever advantage he had hoped to gain from a public confrontation had entirely collapsed. "This is not finished," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, though even he seemed to recognize the emptiness of the threat as he said it. "I believe it is," the Duke said quietly. "Unless you wish to explain to this entire county precisely how you intend to fund a legal challenge, given your current circumstances." Edmund's gaze moved between the Duke, Clara, and the watching crowd, and something in his posture finally broke, the practiced charm giving way entirely to something smaller and more desperate. Without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the gathered onlookers, disappearing out the hall's main doors into the cold afternoon beyond, and did not look back. The silence that followed his departure stretched long enough that Clara began to wonder if the entire hall had simply forgotten to breathe. Then, slowly, the whispered conversations resumed, though their tone had shifted entirely, no longer carrying the sharp edge of scandal that had followed Clara for weeks, but something closer to sympathy, even admiration, for the composed way she had stood her ground. Her aunt found her a few minutes later, pushing through the dispersing crowd with an expression Clara had not seen on her face in months, something like pride, replacing the anxious embarrassment that had defined every conversation between them since the failed wedding. "I did not expect you to speak so plainly," her aunt said, her voice unsteady. "I confess, I feared you would accept whatever settlement he offered, simply to end the difficulty quickly." "I considered it," Clara admitted, "but I found I no longer wished to disappear quietly, for the sake of everyone else's comfort." "I am sorry if that decision brought you further difficulty, Aunt." Her aunt shook her head, something almost fierce entering her expression. "You brought no difficulty I would not gladly bear again, watching you stand as you did today. I am only sorry I did not encourage you to stand sooner." Clara turned to find the Duke watching her from a short distance away, his expression carrying none of the guarded composure she had grown accustomed to over these past weeks. Instead, something open and unmistakably warm had settled there, an expression she recognized now, without needing to question its meaning. "You did not need my help today," he said, once her aunt had stepped away to speak with other well-wishers gathering near the hall's entrance. "You stood your ground entirely on your own merit." "I do not think that is entirely true," Clara said. "I do not know that I would have found the courage to refuse him so plainly, had I not known you were standing beside me, prepared to face whatever consequences followed. Knowing I was not facing him alone made all the difference." "Then perhaps," the Duke said quietly, "we managed it together, exactly as it should have been." Outside, the winter afternoon had brightened considerably, thin sunlight breaking through the clouds that had hung heavy over the county for weeks. Clara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightly wound since the moment she first realized Edmund Caro was not coming to their wedding, a weight she had carried through every quiet, uncertain day since, finally beginning to lift. Whatever came next, whatever consequences still followed from the public confrontation they had just weathered together, Clara understood that she had made a choice today that belonged entirely to herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Whatever the county whispered about her now, it would no longer be the story of a woman abandoned and diminished. It would be the story of a woman who had refused to be collected like an unpaid debt, and had stood, unflinching, in front of everyone who doubted she could. News of Edmund Caro's collapse spread through the county faster than any story Clara had witnessed before, faster even than the original scandal of her abandoned wedding. Within a week, it was widely known that he had left the county entirely for the second time, this time with no expectation of return, and that his remaining creditors had begun proceedings against what little property his family still held. Whatever sympathy the county had briefly extended toward him evaporated entirely, replaced by the quiet, satisfied judgment of people who had always suspected something dishonest beneath his charm, and finally felt vindicated in that suspicion. Clara found herself, in the weeks that followed, the subject of an entirely different kind of attention than she had grown accustomed to. Where once she had been discussed with pity, or worse, quiet amusement at her misfortune, she was now spoken of with something closer to respect, a woman who had faced public humiliation and turned it, through sheer steadiness of character, into something far more admirable. She did not entirely trust this new attention, having learned how quickly a county's opinion could shift in either direction. But she found she could bear it with far more ease than she had ever managed to bear its opposite. She remained at Rutherford Hall through the winter, no longer as a guest sheltering from scandal, but as someone whose presence in the household had become, without any formal arrangement or announcement, simply expected. The Dowager Duchess, who had once approached her with careful, measuring caution, had softened considerably in the weeks since Edmund's public collapse, treating Clara now with a warmth that occasionally startled her. "I confess I misjudged how this would unfold," the Duchess admitted to her one afternoon, as they sat together in the small parlor that had become, over the winter months, their customary place for quiet conversation. "I feared my son's involvement in your situation would cost this family more than it could bear. Instead, I find myself rather grateful for whatever misfortune brought you to our door that day, however difficult it must have been for you to live through." "I am grateful too, Your Grace," Clara said, and meant it entirely, though I do not think either of us expected gratitude to be among the outcomes of that particular day. "Few of life's most important outcomes announce themselves as such at the time," the Duchess said, with a faint, knowing smile that made Clara wonder exactly how much the older woman had already guessed about what remained unspoken between herself and her son. It was the Duke himself, however, who finally spoke what neither of them had yet said aloud, on an evening in early spring, when the last of the winter snow had finally melted from the grounds surrounding Rutherford Hall. They walked together through the gardens as the light faded, past beds where new growth had only just begun pushing through the softened earth, and Clara felt, without needing to be told, that this was not merely another of their familiar evening walks. "I have thought a great deal, these past months, about the day I found you on that road," the Duke said, his voice carrying a quiet seriousness she had learned to recognize as significant. "I told myself, at the time, that I stopped my carriage out of simple decency, nothing more. I have come to understand that explanation was never entirely honest, even with myself." Clara's heart quickened, though she kept her expression carefully composed. What would the honest explanation be then? "That some part of me recognized, even in that first moment, that you were someone I did not wish to lose sight of again, however unlikely that recognition seemed given the circumstances." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the fading light. "I do not offer this lightly, Clara, and I do not offer it because I believe you owe me any gratitude for what assistance I have provided these past months. I offer it because I have come to know you these past seasons, as someone whose character I admire more than any person I have encountered in years, and I find I do not wish to spend my life without you in it." Clara felt something rise in her chest, warm and unsteady, entirely unlike the anxious hope she had once mistaken for affection with Edmund. This felt steadier, surer, built not on performance or charm, but on months of quiet honesty between two people who had, each in their own way, learned to trust carefully, after being taught by circumstance not to trust easily at all. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she asked, though the question felt almost unnecessary given the weight already settled in the air between them. "I am," he said, "though I understand if the prospect of another wedding carries difficult associations for you, given how badly the last attempt concluded. I would understand entirely if you needed time before answering, or if you find you cannot answer at all." "I do not need time," Clara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I spent years agreeing to arrangements, because they seemed sensible, because they promised security, because everyone around me believed them, the wisest available choice. I do not wish to make this decision that way. I wish to make it because I have come to know you honestly, through difficulty rather than performance, and because I find I do not wish to imagine my future without you in it either." "Is that a yes, then?" the Duke asked, something almost boyish breaking through his usual composure, a lightness Clara had rarely glimpsed beneath his careful reserve. "It is a yes," Clara said, and found herself smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded, for what seemed like the first time in longer than she could remember. The news, when it finally reached the village weeks later, produced exactly the astonishment Clara had expected, though not the scandal she had once feared. The story that traveled through the county now was not one of a jilted bride finding hasty consolation, but something the local gossip seemed to relish telling and retelling, with growing embellishment, the tale of a duke who had found his rival's abandoned bride left freezing on a winter road, and had chosen, against every expectation his family's old feud might have suggested, to offer her not merely shelter, but eventually his whole heart. Their wedding took place in early summer, in the same small stone chapel where Clara had once stood waiting for a man who never arrived. She had wondered, in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, whether returning to that same chapel would summon memories too painful to bear. Instead, standing at its entrance, in a gown considerably finer than the one she had worn that winter day, surrounded by guests who had come this time to witness something joyful rather than tragic, she felt only a quiet, settled peace, as though the chapel itself had simply been waiting for the right ceremony to finally take place within its walls. Her aunt wept openly through the entire service, though this time from happiness rather than embarrassment. The Dowager Duchess watched from the front pew with an expression of undisguised pride, occasionally dabbing at her own eyes, despite her earlier insistence that she never cried at weddings. Even Mrs. Aldridge, who had first tended to Clara on that snowy evening months before, stood near the back of the chapel, beaming with the particular satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a difficult story finally reach its proper conclusion. When the vicar finally pronounced them married, and the Duke turned to Clara with an expression of open, unguarded happiness she had come to treasure, more than she ever expected to treasure anything, she felt the last shadow of that first terrible winter day finally lift entirely from her chest. She had come to this chapel once before, prepared to marry a man who valued her only for what she could provide him, and had left it instead, abandoned, humiliated, certain her life had narrowed into something smaller and sadder than she had once hoped for. She had not expected, standing frozen on that empty road months later, that the very man believed to be her fiancé's sworn enemy would become instead the person who taught her what genuine partnership actually looked like, built not on convenience or desperation, but on patience, honesty, and the quiet, steady choice to stand beside someone through difficulty rather than despite it. As they walked together from the chapel into the warm summer afternoon, greeted by the applause and well-wishes of a county that had once only known her as a cautionary tale, Clara understood that she had finally found the life she had once believed she was simply waiting to begin. It had not arrived in the way she expected, through the comfortable, sensible arrangement everyone once urged her toward. It had arrived instead through hardship, through public humiliation, through the unlikely kindness of a stranger who stopped his carriage on a cold winter road for no reason beyond simple decency, and who had, in the months that followed, chosen her again and again, long before either of them had a name for what was growing steadily between them. No one in the county had expected the Duke of Rutherford to marry his rival's abandoned bride, least of all Clara herself, who had once stood on that same chapel steps believing her life had narrowed into nothing but disappointment. She understood now, walking beside her husband into whatever future awaited them both, that the life she had once feared was ending. That winter day had, in truth, only just been beginning. A year passed quickly at Rutherford Hall, filled with the small, steady rhythms of a life Clara had once believed impossible to imagine for herself. She learned the full weight of managing a household as large as the Duke's, learned the names of every tenant family on the estate, learned to sit through long meetings about crop rotations and tenant repairs with an attentiveness that surprised even her husband, who had expected, given her quiet nature, that she might prefer to leave such matters entirely in his hands. "You did not marry a woman content to remain decorative," she told him once, when he expressed mild surprise at finding her deep in conversation with the estate steward about drainage repairs to the tenant cottages. "I spent too many years being told my only value lay in what I could provide someone else. I do not intend to waste this life sitting quietly while decisions are made around me. I would not want you any other way," he said, and she believed him entirely. Lucy returned from Bath that autumn, having heard the full story of her brother's marriage through a series of increasingly dramatic letters from relatives eager to share every detail. She arrived at Rutherford Hall with barely contained excitement, embracing Clara warmly, before she had even removed her traveling cloak. "I cannot believe I missed all of it," Lucy said, settling into the parlor with the particular energy of someone determined to hear every detail firsthand. "My own brother, rescuing a bride from the snow and falling in love with her over the course of a single winter. It sounds like something from a novel." "It felt considerably less romantic while it was happening," Clara admitted, laughing despite herself. "Mostly it felt cold and frightening and uncertain. The romance only became visible afterward, looking back on it. "That is usually how it works, I think," Lucy said, with a wisdom that seemed unexpected from someone so young. "The most important things rarely announce themselves clearly while they are happening. We only recognize their shape once we have some distance from them." Clara found herself growing genuinely fond of Lucy over the following months, grateful for the easy warmth of a sister she had never had, and equally grateful to discover that Lucy harbored none of the wariness Clara had feared she might feel toward a woman who had arrived in her family's life under such scandalous circumstances. If anything, Lucy seemed to delight in the story precisely because of its unlikely beginning, retelling it to visiting friends with an enthusiasm that occasionally embarrassed Clara, though she found she did not truly mind. Word reached them that winter of Edmund Caro's circumstances, carried through the same channels of county gossip that had once carried news of Clara's own humiliation. He had settled, it was said, in a distant county, living considerably reduced from the standing his family had once held. His remaining debts finally settled through the forced sale of what little property remained to him. Clara felt, on hearing the news, none of the satisfaction she once imagined she might feel at his downfall. She felt instead only a quiet, distant relief that his story and hers had finally separated entirely, that she no longer carried any obligation, legal or otherwise, toward a man who had once seen her as nothing more than a convenient solution to his own difficulties. "Do you ever think of him?" the Duke asked her once, gently, sensing perhaps that the question deserved asking, even if the answer seemed obvious. "Rarely," Clara said honestly, "and when I do, it is with less anger than I once expected to feel. I think, mostly, that I am grateful he showed his true character when he did, rather than years into a marriage I could not have escaped so easily. His cowardice that day, as painful as it was to live through, ultimately gave me something I do not think I would have found any other way." Word of their story had, by then, traveled well beyond the county itself, carried through the letters and visits of relatives eager to share what had become, in the retelling, something of a local legend. More than one young woman, having heard the tale of Clara's unlikely rescue, found reason to write to her directly, seeking advice, or simply comfort, after facing similar humiliations of their own. Clara answered each letter personally, understanding better than most the particular loneliness of public disappointment, and finding, in offering whatever comfort she could, a quiet purpose she had not expected to discover in her new position. "You have become something of a confidant to half the disappointed brides in the county," the Duke observed one evening, watching her seal yet another carefully written response before it was sent by the morning post. "I remember exactly how it felt to believe my life had narrowed into nothing but shame," Clara said. "If sharing what I have learned since spares even one other woman that same despair, I consider the correspondence worth every hour it costs me." The Duke watched her a long moment, something warm and unmistakably proud settling across his features. "I do not think I fully understood, that first evening I found you on the road, exactly what kind of woman I was offering shelter to. I assumed I was simply being decent to someone in difficulty. I did not realize I was meeting someone who would go on to change, in her own quiet way, a great many other lives besides her own." "I did not know it either," Clara admitted. "I only knew, that evening, that I was too cold and too frightened to keep walking alone. Everything since has surprised me in ways I never could have predicted." They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them, the fire crackling steadily in the hearth, the same fire that had warmed Clara through her first uncertain night at Rutherford Hall more than a year before. So much had changed since that night, and yet something essential remained exactly as it had been from the very beginning. The quiet, steady sense of safety she had felt the moment the Duke's carriage stopped beside her on that empty winter road, offering shelter, not out of obligation, but out of simple, unhesitating decency. Clara understood now, looking back on everything that had unfolded since, that the worst day of her life had also, in the end, become the beginning of everything that mattered most to her. The abandonment that once felt like the end of every hope she had carried had instead cleared the way toward a life built on honesty rather than convenience, on genuine partnership rather than desperate necessity, and on a love that had grown slowly, carefully, through difficulty rather than despite it. She had once believed, standing frozen and humiliated outside that small stone chapel, that her story had ended in the cruelest possible way. She understood now that it had only just been beginning, and that no one, least of all herself, could have predicted the choice that Winter Road would ultimately lead her toward, or the life that choice would give her the courage to finally claim as entirely her own.